Adam, it's so great to have you on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for joining me.
You are welcome. It's good to be here.
Well, man, I know our content producer, her name is Catherine. She was absolutely geeked out when you agreed to say yes to come and join us on this conversation. And she's the one that's turned me on to your work. She's told me a ton about what you do and the things. And so just diving into it, I'm ecstatic that we get to have this conversation. I know that it's going to benefit so many people. I know your voice is already benefiting so many people. For those who are not familiar with Adam Young, will you just tell us a little bit about what you do, where you're from, kind of what does your life look like? And then this is going to be a unique episode because I don't know if we're going to get much into your story unless we want to, but I'd love to just hear some of the things that you're doing as you're working with people. And we're going to ask a bunch of questions.
Okay. I'm in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is an hour north of Denver. I am a therapist and a podcaster. So I have a podcast called The Place We Find Ourselves that's been going for about 4+ years now. And the podcast largely grew out of the fact that I was a pastor without a pulpit, a preacher without a pulpit, and missed preaching, missed speaking. And so the podcast grew out of the fact that I had lots of things to say and no venue to say it. I was in Atlanta bones, right? When the podcast, that's perfect analogy. Yes. Our scripture reference, fire in my bones. I was in Atlanta when the podcast kind of became an idea. That's where I started my therapy practice, but moved to Fort Collins about 5 years ago. I'm a husband to Caroline, and I've got a daughter who's a freshman in high school and a son who is a 6th grader.
Wow. Man, that's I feel like that fire in your bones is something that you just can't escape, right? If it's a calling, and usually the litmus test of that is, does it start to gather people? Are people being ministered to by what you're saying? And I think that is absolutely 100% the evidence is there for that. Adam, I appreciate your voice and your work. You do a ton of work with story, which is something that we talk about a lot with our Nothing is Wasted community. It's just the power of leaning into your story, engaging with your story. I'm curious, before we dive into why you do work what that work is, I'm curious as to why that has become such a pivotal part of what you do. Why did story become such a big deal for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I can answer it personally and then professionally. Personally, story became such a big deal to me because in my mid-30s, I was in a lot of emotional pain and could not figure out how to make sense of my life and how to experience freedom from anxiety, depression, relationship problems with God. I mean, ever since college, I had such a hunger to understand how the stuff I read about in the Bible or hear about at church actually played out in my life, because I wasn't experiencing abundant life. I wasn't experiencing freedom. And about 35, somewhere in there, somebody introduced me to a book called The Wounded Heart by Dan Allender. And I read it cover to cover, and nothing explained the landscape of my heart better than that book. And so I flew out to Seattle to be with this man for something called Recovery Week for men that have been sexually abused. And that was really my introduction to story. I didn't know that I wouldn't have told you I had a story as a 35-year-old until my time with Dan at Recovery Week. So personally, beginning to look at my story changed my life more than anything else. It began to give me kind of not just an imagination for healing, but like an experience of healing and experiences of freedom and life. And so that was it personally. But the reason the other reason I'm so passionate about story is like professionally, like from a perspective of neuroscience, the integration of narratives, by which I mean making sense of your life experiences in a narrative arc, is absolutely essential for healing to occur in your brain. That's a neuroscience discovery. That's not a Christian claim, though it is very Christian.
Right.
And so the other reason I'm just passionate about story is frankly because, as a therapist, you get trained in lots of different therapeutic modalities, i.e. ways of doing therapy. And some work better than others. And none of those modalities or approaches, in my experience, work better than what we call story work.
Why is it that you wouldn't have described your life as having a story? What was it that was kind of, is this, you didn't have a framework for it? No frame of reference? Like you just didn't, or what was it that blocked you from?
No, it's worse than that. Okay. Yeah. I would have said, so as a sophomore in high school, I went up to my mom and dad's bedroom. My mom was asleep. My dad's on his bed doing, work from the day, 9:00 at night. And I said to my Dad, so many of my friends come from either divorced homes or parents are in the midst of a divorce or they've got a sibling on drugs. Why is our family so good and healthy when so many of my friends' families are not? Now, I was saying that as somebody who had been physically abused by my father, terrorized by him, and sexually abused by my mother. As a sophomore in high school, I asked that question. So the point I'm trying to make is we all think our stories are normal because it's what we grew up in. It was normal for you. Whatever you experienced, if you experienced abuse, it is very unlikely that you're going to think of that as abuse. You're just going to think of it as that's the way stuff was in my family. And so, fast forward my sophomore year to a 35-year-old man, I would have told you that I came from a good Christian home. I would have said that my mother was the gift from God to kind of soothe the violence from my father. And that narrative was actually backwards. It wasn't untrue. It just was pointing in the wrong direction. It made my mother into an angel when, in fact, she was actually orchestrating most of the abuse in our home. So as a 35-year-old, I had no sense of, I have been traumatized.
Yeah.
No sense of that. Wouldn't have said that.
So then it began manifesting itself. And you couldn't understand why. And that's what led you to
That's right.
I got it. There's something that's not here. And all of a sudden the dots were being put together.
Yes.
Wow. So as you dove into story work in this retreat especially, and I love how you said experiential healing, right? It became more than just a cerebral know-how, which often that's where the church lives, right? The church lives in this cerebral.
Yeah.
It's not a bad thing, right? We need truth and God's word, and we need to know the truth, and the truth will set us free. And I've hidden your word in my heart so I might not sin against all these things, right? That's good for us to know God's word, but I think sometimes we underplay the value of what you just talked about and experiencing healing from a living God, right? And understanding our story.
Yes.
Talk about your encounter with that then, and why was that so pivotal for you to dive into all of this?
Do you mean talk about my experience of healing or my experience of God?
Well, maybe both, but
both.
I don't know how they're intertwined, but particularly pertain to this aha moment or this season that you had where you went off to this retreat and you're like, whoa,
right.
And then leading you on that journey. What was that? Unpack that a little bit more. Because people, they're listening to this, some people, they don't have a frame of reference for an experiential healing, right? They're like, I know this, but we've said this, you experience it. What do you mean by that, right?
Yeah. Okay. Here's what I mean by that. We are, because of God, embodied creatures. All right. Western evangelical type Christians need to come to terms with that. We are embodied. And that means that we don't just have a brain above our neck. We have all manner of physical sensations coursing through our bodies all the time. Those physical sensations tell the truth about our heart. And by that, I mean what we desire and what breaks our heart.
Wow.
Our desires and our disappointments. Those physical sensations tell the truth about our idolatries and where we actually have immense love for God. But our cognitive thoughts don't tell a lick about the true nature of our hearts. I mean, anybody can, sign a creedal doctrinal statement. It doesn't tell me anything about your heart. Nothing. What tells me about your heart is the sensations in your gut, your chest, your throat, as you are talking about your heartaches, your tragedies, your traumas.
I don't know if I've ever heard anybody put it that way, but that is exactly true. Because often, and I don't know where, where you might say this would break down, but so many times you're going to hear pastors talk about the importance of preaching truth to yourself, right? And in some ways, based on what you're saying, in some ways that seems like it could be very, very helpful, but in some ways it could also seem like it's a little bit of a whitewash solution.
Well, here's where it gets dangerous. And I just know this personally. I mean, for years, I would have anxiety and I would say, Adam, Philippians 4, don't be anxious about anything. Trust God. Your anxiety is telling you something about your idolatries. You need to put your faith in God. And I would say that to myself. And none of those sentences are untrue. However, they were allowing me to literally avoid what I was anxious about. Anxiety, depression, any emotion, any felt sensation in our bodies is telling us a truth about our heart and about our story, which is to say about what we want and about what has happened to us in life, in the world. And so emotions, sensation, which are first physical sensations in the body, emotions tell you the truth about who you are and who you worship. And if I'm using a verse of the Bible to allow me to not be curious about what I'm feeling and why I'm anxious, for example, then that's just working against the kingdom of God in my heart.
Wow. Man, this is like paradigm shifting, Adam, like for so many of us, because in the church, consistently, emotions have been made an enemy, right? Like that's like the villain.
In the white evangelical American church, that's true.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so then,
as a matter of fact, let me something just popped to mind, Davey. When I was in college, there was a very famous illustration kind of in the evangelical circles I ran in. And it was a little train with three cars on it.
Yep.
And what's that?
Yep. The train.
You remember it.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
the train, the first car said facts. The second car, the middle car said faith. And the caboose said feelings. And the idea when this was preached about was that I am to put my faith in the facts of the Bible, and then my feelings will get in line with that. Now, as somebody who just had such a deep love for God in college, that tormented me because my feelings they were tormenting. I was in pain. They weren't good. And so I felt ashamed and guilty that I wasn't putting my faith in the facts of Scripture. And look, that illustration, I mean, we could talk about that for an hour, but it is well, frankly, it's diabolical. And here's what I mean by diabolical. It is of the kingdom of darkness, because feelings are our first, and by the first I mean quickest in our brain, experience of anything in the present. Before we think a thought, we can't. This is not a choice. Your cognitive brain, your prefrontal cortex, does not come online until you have already felt something about a difficult interaction, a conflict, a joyful sunset, anything. You feel first.
Wow.
Then you can think about the Bible. And I'm not saying don't think about the Bible. I'm just saying, look, let's be honest about how the body works. Yeah. You feel first.
So then how do we, there's so much of even the story work, right? If we go back to that, what we originally started with is this idea of rewriting some of that to aid in the healing process, or to create space for that healing process to happen. But then also, it's supposed to then affect our emotions to some level, right?
Absolutely.
So where do we, where that metaphor breaks down, then where do we right size that? How do we rewrite the feelings, or what we're experiencing, the truth that our feelings are telling us about what we truly believe? How do we begin to rewrite some of that stuff?
Well, the first step to rewriting your story is naming what has been true. And in biblical language, that's the word confession. So in the Greek, confess is homo legeo, homo sameness, legeo speaking. So what it means is to speak sameness with God about the world, about reality, about the past, about the present, about my heart. Confess. So an invitation to engage your story is merely an invitation to confess, to speak sameness with God about what has been true for you, particularly in your family of origin. And that's the starting point of rewriting a story. Naming what has been true is actually, it's more than 50% of the battle to healing. And I don't even like the word battle. It's more than 50% of the journey to healing. Just naming, just confession. We haven't even moved into kind of like living differently or experiencing or making different choices. None of that. Just the naming of what actually happened, truthfully. Because frankly, most of us live life with illusions. Barbara Kingsolver has a great line in the Poisonwood Bible where she says that, let me get it right. Illusion mistaken for truth is the pavement under our feet. It is what we call civilization. Now that is a prophetic sentence. Illusions mistaken for truth are the pavement under our feet. Nowhere is that more true than with regard to every single person's individual story, unless you've engaged your story.
Yeah. Well, and then to your point, like what you said earlier, you have to not only engage your story, but kind of engage it and measure it in some ways against, and maybe I'm not hearing you correctly, but measure it against what is actually true, right? Because earlier you said like your story came out as like, this is my story, right? That my dad was abusive. My mom was kind of helping to assuage the, but then as you begin to engage with it, you realize that's not actually true. That was just,
that's right.
Your perception of that.
That's right. And I needed other voices to do that. In other words, nobody can engage their story by themselves. They have to share parts of their story with trusted, wise guides who can then speak into their story with both curiosity, kindness, some measure of confrontation, in order for the naming to go from illusion to truthfulness.
Wow. This is amazing, Adam. Okay. So who are those guides? Like, I mean, it can't just be anybody, because they've got to have some measure of,
Nope.
like what you just said, some measure of training or experience in doing this, right? Well, who would that be?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That is the question of the hour. So there are people that my first experience with these people was through the Allender Center, named after Dan Allender. These are people who have been trained to engage narratives of harm, particularly in one's family of origin. In other words, they've been trained about how to name me well, given the stories I share about my growing up years. This training I don't want anyone to hear that this training is synonymous with getting a LPC, licensed professional counselor, or for me, I'm a social worker, licensed clinical social worker, or a PhD in psychology. I do not care about any of that training or those credentials. It's not that I don't care about the training. I wish the training programs were a lot better. But those training programs and the alphabet soup you get after your name in no way qualifies you to do this work. In no way.
Wow.
What qualifies you to do this work is engagement of your own story, engagement of your God in the midst of your heartaches, honest, authentic, psalm-like engagement of God, and some measure of supervision, i.e. other people watching you do work who are better at it than you and training you. That's what qualifies you for this work.
Wow.
Where do you find those people? That is the question of the hour.
Yeah, it really is, because, I mean, there are probably a lot of people listening to this that they have almost given up on the idea of counseling, or that counseling could work for them, because there's so many variables for who could be a appropriate and rightly matched counselor for you, you know?
Yeah.
So here's I'd love to kind of jump into this right here, because you got to find the right person, right? You have to find the right guide that's experienced. But one of the things too that I feel like needs to happen, and this has kind of been a fresh thought, but I want to hear your thoughts on it. Trauma has become something that people are talking about. 15, 20 years ago, especially in the church world, it wasn't being talked about. So I'm grateful that we're actually addressing this now. And, you know, I wouldn't have talked about it until I walked through what I did 7 years ago. It wasn't part of my vocabulary, or even something like I had a wonderful upbringing. You know, we're talking about family of origin, I had a great family. Okay. And so it wasn't part, but then I saw in my own life what the effects of that traumatic experience, and then the ensuing grief that I was dealing with, what that did to me. And then it put me in circles with other people who were, you know, there was a lot of solidarity. Other people were going through really difficult things. And now this entire ministry that's built out with people who are coming to say, okay, I've gone through these really difficult things. You have to have the answers for me. So I'm the first to say you've got to address trauma and lean into it. But it feels like trauma can also become kind of just a buzzword that we just place as well onto maybe minor inconveniences or discomforts in life, right? How would you draw the line of demarcation to say, all right, hey guys, this is trauma. This is what you would categorize as trauma. And this right here is kind of some normal pressures or distresses of life that every human being is going to deal with. Is there a line of demarcation? To what degree? I'm sure it's on a continuum.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. There's a difference between adversity and trauma. Trauma requires two things to be true. Number one, powerlessness to move your body or use your voice in such a way as to make the bad thing stop happening. So for something to be traumatic, you have to have some experience of deep powerlessness. You can't use your voice or move your body to make the bad thing stop happening. Number two, abandonment by potentially protective caregivers. In other words, for something to be traumatic, so here's Bessel van der Kolk's the iconic trauma expert, who says a really helpful illustration. He says, look, at 9/11, they've done lots of research on the folks that were at ground zero on 9/11. The ones that could run home and have significant other loved ones, receive them, hold them, cry with them, process their emotions with them, tell the story, narrate it, those folks were not traumatized. So there is a difference. A lot of people don't understand this. There is a difference between a harsh event, a harmful event, and something becoming what's called embedded trauma. Trauma has nothing to do with the event. Nothing. Trauma is about what happens in your body after the bad event when there is not sufficient care. So adversity, adversity is adversity. Everyone experiences some measure of adversity. That's not trauma. Trauma is the powerlessness and the abandonment, which is really to say betrayal by people who should have been there for you and weren't.
The Nothing is Wasted content library of resources and podcast episodes are made possible by our growing community of members. If you would like to be a part of having a global impact and help people partner with God to take back their stories, consider joining Community Plus for just $20 a month. Your membership comes with access to a course called Position for Redemption, masterclasses taught by our certified coaches, bonus podcast episodes, and Q&As with myself and some of our other special guests. You can get more information and sign up at nothingiswasted.com/community. I look forward to connecting with you further within our Community Plus platform.
Trauma is the powerlessness and the abandonment, which is really to say betrayal by people who should have been there for you and weren't.
So if we thread these two conversations together, then, this idea of your recognizing your own story, especially going back to family of origin, compound that with some kind of an experience of trauma, then I guess what I'm wondering is, people experience trauma and maybe they're like an actual event, some kind of tragedy, loss, name it, whatever category we want to name it, but they're going to experience more of the outworking of that, or they're going to experience that trauma through the lens of all of the other things that have taken place throughout their life in their family of origin, right?
Yes. And that is a very important sentence. Because what you're saying, Davey, is that the way the brain operates is it filters all present experiences, including harmful, possibly traumatic ones,
right,
through the lens of what you have already experienced in the world, particularly when you're really, really young and your brain is forming its foundational ways of experiencing and interpreting the world and growing at a very rapid rate, which is the first 2 to 3 years of your life. So none of us experience the world and reality as it is. That you can't do that because you have neurons, and that's not how neurons operate. Neurons interpret present experience based on their past experiences.
Wow. It's just so wild to me, right? That like we can't experience things absolutely true. So we need things outside of our own experience to give us the barometer for what is absolutely true.
Yeah, and this, of course, it is kind of unsettling, but it also can relieve a whole lot of pressure, for example, in a marriage relationship. Most marriages know what it's like to fight about the same 2 or 3 things for 2 decades. It's not because everyone is dumb. There's something else going on. It's because the 2 partners, the 2 spouses they are interpreting the same event very differently. That's because they each have neurons and their neurons are working.
Well, okay, but some people, some couples specifically, if we're going down this road, they're able to recognize those things. They're able to process through those, begin to see from the other person's perspective. But like, how does that get, like, how do you do that? You know what I mean? Because there's a lot of us who are listening to this right now and we're going, hey, I resonate with that, right? I've experienced trauma. You've experienced trauma. Gosh, you know, my wife and I now, we both came together, blending a family, both having experienced our own version of trauma in our past. Her, a long-standing childhood trauma with an abusive dad, and me losing my wife in an extremely traumatic way. And so we see this manifest in our relationship where we're like, we're bringing really broken stories into what on some days we would say an absolutely beautiful relationship. And on other days we'd say it's a hot mess. How do we begin to even start with recognizing those things and start to untangle that a little bit, you know, in the midst of the pressures of life?
Yes. Fantastic question. The starting point is paying attention to what's happening in your bodies. So it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Whenever you are engaged in some measure of disagreement or conflict with your spouse, your body will get what's called dysregulated. In other words, you'll either kind of start to amp up into kind of anxious, panic, angry mode, or you'll tend to like kind of shut down, detach, go numb, distant, dissociated. Each of those ends of the spectrum are what's called dysregulated bodies, dysregulated affect. And our dysregulation, which happens many, many times a day, tells the truth about what's called implicit memory. It tells us the truth of our stories. It tells us how our brains have been shaped to anticipate around every bend. So we respond far more to facial expression and tone of voice than to words.
Yeah.
Your wife gets a look on her face and a tone in her voice, and a part of your brain called your limbic system reacts to that. That reaction will tell you the truth about your story if you are curious about it and can slow down enough to pay attention to it. So the starting point to what you're asking, Davey, is slowing down enough to notice what's happening in my body when I get dysregulated, and then to be curious about why am I feeling what I'm feeling about her facial expression or tone of voice.
It seems like it's a skill, right? That has to be cultivated.
It is.
It doesn't seem like something that would come natural when you're going into either one of those states of disassociation or heightened, expression.
That's right. It is a skill, and it is called mindfulness, and it is not taught very often in American schools. That is changing, largely because of the pioneering work of a neuroscientist named Dan Siegel. That's changing.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so here's what's really cool about this conversation up to this point. You've said a few terms that people kind of throw out. Mindfulness,
Yeah.
There's been some things that just we've almost assumed that everybody understands exactly this is, but you've explained these very well for us to be able to actually know undergirding, like, what is this that is going on? What is this? How is this term defined? Okay.
Yes.
And I think that's so helpful because what I've found in some of the different church circles that, you know, we're fortunate enough to kind of bounce around into is that there's resistance to some of this conversation.
Yes.
In church circles.
Yeah, you better believe it.
I'm sure you found that as well. Can you just give us kind of your evaluation of that? Why does there seem to be resistance, and why, in your, I mean, I'm assuming in your opinion, there shouldn't be resistance, right? Because, you know, I'm of the opinion that science tells us, oh, that's how God designed this to work, right? That they should coexist and integrate very seamlessly. But can you why the resistance to this, and especially in church circles?
Yeah, sure. I will quote my friend and mentor, Dan Allender. The truth is largely lacking in our world, and most people aren't fond of it. And that includes most Christians. Most Christians do not want to feel what's happening in their bodies as a result of their day at work, with their kids, with their spouse, with their prayer time in God. Most Christians do not have the courage to be honest about what they are actually feeling in their bodies as they go about their day.
Do you feel like it's always been that way?
Sad. Oh,
was there any point in history where we
always
were
been
better versed at this? You know, like, or is this?
I'm not a historian. There are pockets. I mean, you know, there are authors you can read at you know, going back to the early desert church fathers and mothers to, you know, the Richard Rohrs of today. There are people today and, you know, 1700s, 50 who wrote about this stuff, and experienced it, and commented and lamented on, you know, look, the truth is lacking, and people around me don't want to feel. So I don't know that we're any, you know, worse than or better than in times past, but I'm not a historian. I do have a pretty good sense of what's happening and been happening in what I'll call the white evangelical church over the past 30 years, because I've been a part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. You were about to say that's sad, because I'm sorry I cut you off there.
It's sad. Here's why it's sad. Yeah, here's why it's sad. Couple reasons. Number one, the Bible includes a ton of language of people being incredibly honest about their big feelings. The book of Psalms, Lamentations, the book of Job. Look, there are pockets in Jeremiah. There is a ton of language in the scripture that is acute, visceral, gritty expressions of rage at other people who have done the psalmist an injustice. In fact, there are more verses in the Psalter either asking God to deal with your enemies or praising God for dealing with your enemies than anything else.
Wow.
The reason it's sad, one of the reasons the state of Christians' relationship to their emotions is sad, is because it's unbiblical. But the other reason it's sad, frankly, is because it's ultimately birthed in fear, a fear and shame. That my big emotions are not welcome in my church, in my community, in my small group, with my friends. That if I told them what I really felt inside, and all my envy, and all my shame, and all my sorrow, that I wouldn't be welcomed in this community any longer. And that is so antithetical to what Jesus came to do on the earth that it enrages me.
Yeah. And it almost is one of those things where when you recognize that, you go, how did it wind up here?
That's right. Yes.
How do we get so far away from the community that Jesus created, or the communities that he spawned directly in the early church that became a safe haven for the broken?
Yep.
So you kind of brought up and you may have indirectly brought this up, but a lot of folks who are listening to this, they have been wounded or hurt or abused, by an actual perpetrator, someone who, much of their wounding is not necessarily, it's not self-inflicted. It's someone else has inflicted this on them.
Right.
It seems to be, this seems to be a place that the enemy really loves to, kind of creep into our lives, leveraging these types of woundings.
Yes. Yes.
And so I'm hearing you say, right, it's, we see an example of the psalmists who are like, for instance, break the teeth of my enemies, right? And yet
that's right.
It also doesn't seem on the other end of the spectrum healthy or wholesome of us to, kind of sit with that type of bitterness as well. It seems to lead to our undoing. So what's the I guess the role of evil in our lives, or when we find ourselves in those kinds of situations, how do we begin to untangle that? I mean, I'm in a situation like that. Literally, Adam, next week at the time of this recording, I'm going to be sitting in court at my late wife's trial.
That's right.
And I'm going to be staring the person who murdered her in the face. Right. And so every day I'm having to live with it. Every day I'm having to wake up to that reality that she's gone and that it was at the hand of somebody else. Now I'm actually staring at that person, spending a week in the same room with that person. Right. That's not good for my soul unless I approach it differently. Right. How would you, as someone who is helping people learn their stories, discover their stories, recognize perpetrators in their life, in some instances where they didn't recognize it before, then begin to untangle that and live that out differently?
Yeah. So I have never had to do what you are going to do next week. Never done that. I have never had to look at the person who took my bride, my partner from me. The closest I have come to that is I have had to look at my father, who physically abused me, emotionally, verbally abused me, terrorized me.
Yeah.
But I have not had to do what you're going to have to do next week. I know a few people who have. And ironically, one of them was a client. So you would have to teach me there what it's been like for you leading up to that, what it will be like next week, what it will be like as you ponder and process that day, in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Well, let's take it out of what for a lot of people would seem like an extreme case, right? I mean, I will say this. What I try to help people understand is everybody's experience of pain is going to be different, but don't compare pain, right? In fact, that can often cause us to diminish the experience of our own pain when we look at somebody else and go, wow, I've never had to go through what you've had to go through, right? And so we don't even acknowledge or get curious about our own pain. So there are a lot of people who are listening to this, most people who are listening to this who have not experienced that level of, that type of perpetration. But a lot of people have experienced a close family member, someone who should have provided protection and safety.
Yep.
And fostered a sense of that safe haven in their upbringing, and they're having to face that person at Thanksgiving or face that person at Christmas or be in that person's life consistently.
Yes.
And that not undo them. So how do you How do you do that, right? Because we'd rather go, I'm just going to avoid them.
Yes. You're saying it really well. That's what most Christians do with those who have harmed them deeply. They withdraw and avoid. That's not what God did with Israel very often. And it's never what God did with Israel ultimately. In other words, a lot of people don't realize this, but there are times in God's relationship with Israel where he withdrew from them because he could not bear their perpetration, but he always returned. And in many ways, if you read the Old Testament, like cover to cover, in many ways, what the Old Testament is fundamentally about is the change wrought in the heart of God as he is wrestling with what to do with his beloved people who will not respond to him in faithfulness. And he is torn. There's no one more ambivalent than God in the Old Testament. So with that kind of as preface, what you're inviting the listeners into is to grapple with their posture towards those who have harmed them, whether it's a father, a mother, a grandfather, or a coworker, or a pastor, to grapple with what is your posture toward the person who has severely harmed you.
Yeah.
And the first step and the most important step in navigating that question is you need to determine something of the heart of that person, because Jesus treated people differently based on their heart. And I did a 5-part series of episodes on this very question because it comes up in therapy, in my therapy room so many times. I was just like, look, I need to put this out there. Yeah. And I think it's called like, how do you engage someone who's harmed you or something like that, part 1 through 5. But the first step is you have to determine, is this person what I call, or I think Dan Allender called it, a garden variety sinner? In other words, is this person someone who has the willingness to own and rectify the harm they have done?
Wow.
If not, if this person is not someone where you have any data that they are willing to suffer the feeling of shame, healthy shame, so that they are convicted in their heart and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. Tell me more about that. What was that like for you? How can I make this right? If that is not the posture of the person who has wounded you, then that person is, in biblical language, wicked. And you need to engage with a wicked person very differently than engaging with a garden variety sinner. And, you see that with Jesus. He engaged Pharisees very different than the woman at the well. Yeah. Very differently. So differently, it's like it's a different person.
Right. What does that mean, though? So, I mean, even as you say that, I'm sure there are people who are going, oh, I recognize the people in my life that are, biblically speaking, wicked, right? You've just delineated that for me. Oh, I recognize the people in my life that I should engage with. Practically speaking, what is the difference between how I engage with each one of those?
Well, like if my wife harms me, when my wife harms me, like I can say to her, ouch, that hurt.
Yeah.
And she will hear what I'm saying. And the part of her brain called the resonance circuitry will allow her to feel something in her body of what it must have been like for me when she said that cruel thing or did that cruel thing. And that will cause in her heart in her gut what the Bible calls conviction of sin. And you know, that felt sense of like, ugh, like I hurt someone. Ugh.
Yeah.
And from that belly place come the words, I'm sorry, or I was wrong. Or how can I make this right? How can I do this differently? What do you need from me so that this doesn't happen again? All right. That's my wife. Like, I can say that to her, ouch, and she will respond with conviction and an attempt to repair and make it right. That's holy. That's so beautiful when that happens. Not all people are willing to do that. Yeah. And that is what puts them in this other category that I call wicked.
Yeah.
The fundamental, most people, when they think of wicked people, they think, oh, that means people that do really bad things to lots of people. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing. Wicked people, the mark of a wicked person is not doing really bad things lots of the time. The mark of a wicked person is the unwillingness to tolerate a sense of shame and guilt and feel what the Bible calls conviction of sin. And, it says that the job of the Spirit is to convict the world of guilt with regard to sin. That's what that's what this is talking about. That's what this is. And when you say no to that, when your spirit won't let that in, the language in the Bible is hardened of heart, or it's also called the blasphemy of the Spirit. There's no way to move forward relationally with someone like that.
Wow. So I'm assuming, I know there's a lot of people who would want me to ask this question. Say there's someone who's experienced a sexual betrayal or some kind of betrayal from a spouse.
Yeah.
And there is that evidence of remorse. They're taking on that. They're having the courage to take on that shame. They're, I am so sorry for what I've done and how this has affected you. They're displaying that. But maybe they're not demonstrating change, or not demonstrating change at the pace that the partner would want them to. Is there a certain way to handle those kinds of situations? I mean, I know every situation's unique, so there's a lot of nuance in that, of course, but are there like guiding principles that can help us to know? Because this isn't just one momentary instance, right? There's the carrying out of this as well, and the living in relationship and in community and intimacy, and
Yeah.
So
I mean, your question gets at the very complex and mysterious dynamics of a marriage.
Yeah.
And this is a very hard truth to come to terms with, but people who are harmed by their spouse deeply, deep betrayals, they have to ask themselves, how did I allow this to happen? And I am in no way saying it's their fault. If your spouse cheated on you, I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm saying there has to be a curiosity about, because nobody has an affair or develops a pornography addiction overnight. Okay.
Right.
These things, the seeds of it, you can see it in retrospect, year 5 of my marriage, year 7, year 8. And there has to be a curiosity of how did that occur? Because every marriage is a dance, and both partners are participating in that dance. Yeah. So again, I'm in no way assigning blame to someone who has been traumatized or wounded by their spouse. But you have to ask the question of how did this happen? And that will inevitably drive you into your story.
Wow.
And when you've engaged your story, you will be able to engage your spouse differently going forward. I mean, especially for Christians, like of the evangelical stripe, like in my experience, most Christians are far more committed to the marriage than they are to loving their spouse. To say it differently, if you have never thought about divorcing your spouse, I question your commitment to them.
To unpack that, say that again, because that seemed like a very contrary statement.
It is. I know it's paradoxical. If you have never thought about divorcing your spouse, I question your commitment to loving that person. I would be very curious about your commitment, maybe to the, I believe that you might be committed to the marriage. And to staying married. But that's not what Jesus calls us to. Jesus calls you to love your spouse. That's very different than staying married to them. And so we are, we are sinful people, and nowhere does our sin manifest more dramatically than in marriage, than in close, intimate relationships. And so if you've been with somebody for 20 years, and this happens with my clients all the time. I will simply say to them all the time, I will say, I'm working with a man, for example, if your wife was I'm pointing to the chair. I've got two chairs here where they sit. If your wife was sitting there and I asked her, or rather I asked you, the husband, to prove to me that she's a sinner, could you do it? I can't tell you how many people are silent for minutes. That is deeply problematic. That's going back to the Barbara Kingsolver quote about illusions mistaken for truth. Many, many Christians are very unwilling to honestly look at the depravity in the hearts of their spouse because, well, there's a lot of reasons, but an unwillingness to look at that it'll keep you from, divorcing them, but it will also keep you from loving them. Because your task as a spouse is to present your spouse to Jesus holier than when you met them. And you can't do that unless you are aware of their idolatries and their sin.
Wow.
So frankly, most of what we call love is rather anemic. It's niceness. I'm not going to say anything that'll upset you. That's not love. That's cowardice.
Man. This is one of those moments where you don't want to be the podcast host because you're wanting to internalize what you just said so deeply because it has impacted you so much. Wow. Adam, man. Listen, I could sit here and ask you questions for hours and hours and hours. I wish I could take every situation that somebody has brought to us through this ministry, through this podcast, and go, "Hey, Adam, what would you say about this right here? What would you say about this?" This has been awesome. I know we have we've got to finish because of time, but I'm so grateful for even the time that you spent sharing with us. And I know we bounced around in a billion different places. I didn't even get to half the questions I had for you. But listen, if you're, I know everybody who is listening to this has been impacted by this conversation. You need to go and listen to Adam's podcast, The Place We Find Ourselves. It is hands down one of the best podcasts that are out there. And I don't just say that to flatter you, man. It really is. And so where else can people follow what you're doing? Where can we just kind of tune in to you a little bit more?
I'm on Instagram at Adam Young Counseling. And then I've got my website, adamyoungcounseling.com, which has got, if you're interested, if you're listening to this and you're like, hey, I do want to explore my story, I've got some great resources. They're free that can help you start that process on my website.
Wow. That's awesome, man. Thank you so much. Seriously. This has been really, really profound for me personally. I know for everybody who's listening to this. And so thanks so much for spending time with us and being generous with that, with your limited time. It's been awesome.
It's been fun for me, Davey. You're a great interviewer.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.